Do the Dead Sea Scrolls contain an account of a vision that describes Salt Lake City, Utah as a future city of God? What follows is from a paper I wrote in September of 2012 about a very interesting discovery I made in the Dead Sea Scrolls about a New Jerusalem and its possible connection to Salt Lake City, as established by Brigham Young in 1847. The Salt Lake Valley is unique. Besides being populated with culturally peculiar Mormons, it incorporates a singular combination of design characteristics. Remarkably, this same combination showed up in the Dead Sea Scrolls in what is termed the New Jerusalem Scroll, which was discovered in the late 1940s. I want to outline here the similarities between these two cities and explore the possible relevance of the subject to the LDS Church in the latter days. About a century before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, Brigham Young planned out the Great Salt Lake City following the pattern of Joseph Smith's City of Zion plan, which was revealed to Joseph in 1833. Elements of that plan are still reflected in the Salt Lake Valley today, and below is a selection of 7 of them. First, it's a city of God. Latter-day Saints look forward to someday establishing a New Jerusalem in Missouri. But in the interim, they established Salt Lake City as a transitional city of God, with the goal of eventually becoming a Zion people worthy to establish the true city of Zion in Missouri. In other words, one city of God to prepare for the next, higher version. The second element of design characteristics is that Brigham Young plotted into the Salt Lake Valley a regular grid of equilateral city blocks. Thirdly, he set the city in place using the cosmos as his template. Young aligned this grid to the compass, with the streets running east to west and north to south. The fourth element is the wide streets. Young divided his large city blocks with ridiculously wide streets, predicting that someday the small settlement would need streets of this size. Also, Brigham Young surrounded his city blocks with unusually wide sidewalks. This was not something all the cities were doing in those days. The sixth element that Young used was based on his street numbering system being relevant to the Salt Lake Temple site decades before the temple was actually built, rather than on the location of the Utah Capitol or some other government building, which is often done in other capital cities. This element is emphasized further by the fact that the streets surrounding the temple are named for their position relative to the temple, such as North Temple, West Temple, South Temple, etc. North Temple is a major 6-lane road coming out of Salt Lake City as one of the city's major thoroughfares. The final and 7th element is that it's an unusually large continuous city. The cities of the Salt Lake Valley are distinct and separate. However, Brigham Young established one long continuous street numbering system connecting and running through these cities. Those street numbers are based on the grid surrounding the temple in Salt Lake City. For instance, the city of Murray is politically distinct from the Salt Lake City proper, but has nonetheless always been on 5,000 south, counting down from the Salt Lake Temple in Salt Lake City. Sandy City, further south, is also on the Salt Lake Temple grid at about 9,500 south. What were once disparate cities have today grown together into one super city, which is larger than would have seemed reasonable in the 1840s. And it seems apparent that Brigham Young planned it that way. So during their lives, Brigham Young and Joseph Smith had access to at least 2 scriptural plans for cities of God. One in the Old Testament in Ezekiel 48, and the second in the New Testament in Revelation 21. Each gives explicit descriptions of a city of God. Ezekiel's city appears to be a vision of Jerusalem, as it will be in the millennium. And John's vision appears to be describing a new Jerusalem when it is lifted up while earth is transformed into its final glory, and then dropped safely down into place onto a cleansed earth ready for the millennium. In the late 1940s, a large cache of ancient text was discovered near the ruins of an ancient community named Qumran near the Dead Sea. Evidence indicates that its inhabitants considered Qumran to be a spiritual haven from Babylon and from the spiritually lost Jerusalem. Among the texts sealed away by these Zion seekers was a distinct account of a vision of what modern-day translators term a New Jerusalem. Although that term does not actually appear in the text, the vision is filled with specific measurements and details of the city, many of which do not correspond to Ezekiel's or John's cities of God, but they do correspond very closely with Brigham Young's city today in the Salt Lake Valley. Let's take a look at the remarkable corollaries between the Dead Sea Scrolls account of a city of God and Brigham Young's Great Salt Lake City. So the excerpts I use are quotations from the Dead Sea Scrolls, a new translation by Wise Abigan Cook from chapter 12, A Vision of the New Jerusalem. So first of all, the Dead Sea Scroll account of the New Jerusalem is also a plan for a city of God. It was given to an unknown prophet in a vision. Like Brigham's plan, this New Jerusalem is an abode of God's elect, or a Zion. The modern translators of the scroll describe the New Jerusalem this way, quote, "The city itself was divided into square blocks like a checkerboard. Each block was surrounded by a spacious street, and the city as a whole was divided by larger streets, 3 passing from east to west and 2 passing from north to south." End quote. The actual scroll describes large, perfectly square blocks. Another quote, "Then he brought me into the city and measured all the city blocks, length and breadth, and they measured 51 staffs by 51 staffs, making a square, 357 cubits to each side." End quote. The city of God in the scrolls is also set to the compass, just as Brigham Young's Great Salt Lake City. Quote, "The width of the streets that go from south to north for 2 of them, 9 staffs with 4 cubits to each street, making 67 cubits. He measured the middle street in the middle of the city. Its width was 13 staffs and 1 cubit, that is 92 cubits." End quote. So this is just one of many passages in the text describing the north, south, east, west template for this inspired city plan. Also, the translators of the scroll refer to spacious streets intersecting the square city blocks. Again, we see a strong correlation to Brigham's vision. And again, we see that the grid is based on the compass with wide streets, some streets standing out as being wider than the others. Quote, "So he showed me the measurement of all the blocks. Between each block was a street 6 staffs in widths, that is 42 cubits. The main streets that passed from east to west were 10 staffs. The width of the street was 70 cubits for 2 of them." End quote. One apt description of Salt Lake City could be that it is simply made up of large square blocks surrounded by sidewalks. This is not a city plan one would have seen in ancient times or even on the American frontier in the 1840s. However, Brigham Young and the author of the scroll both emphasize sidewalks as a notable element of their city plans. The scroll says, quote, "Each block had a sidewalk around it, bordering the street, 3 staffs, that is 21 cubits." End quote. To be honest, I was pretty surprised to see the word sidewalk show up in a description of an ancient city. Just as Salt Lake City was built around a temple which did not yet exist, the scroll account also describes a city and city streets built around and in relation to a temple. The translators of the scroll state, quote, "The temple scroll and the present text, A Vision of the New Jerusalem, reconstructed from several scrolls, is a detailed description of a Jerusalem to be given by an angel to an unknown recipient, quite in the manner of Ezekiel's vision, but differing in many details. No description of the temple itself survives in the fragments, but the temple is mentioned several times." End quote. So in addition to numbering all the streets of the entire valley off of the unbuilt temple, Brigham also named the streets directly surrounding the temple after their relation to it. Above, we mentioned the North Temple acting as a major east-west thoroughfare in and out of Salt Lake City. It is interesting that in the scroll, too, a large street just north of the temple is referred to as the street, quote, "north of the temple," end quote. Both Brigham's city and the New Jerusalem have a version of an important North Temple. And here's a quote. A third street, which was on the north of the temple, he measured at 18 staffs in width, that is 124 cubits. End quote. It might have seemed strange to early Mormon settlers that cities far south of Salt Lake City had their streets numbered after an unbuilt temple in Salt Lake City. Even today, Sandy, Murray, and others all have their own city councils and mayors. However, they have streets that are numbered as though they were an extension of the temple in Salt Lake City. Today, with population growth, the entire valley has grown into one very large city. Notice what the translators say about the size of the city envisioned in the scrolls. Quote, "The dimensions of the visionary city and buildings are too large to be realistic. The city, for example, measures 140 stades on the east and west, and 100 stades on the north and south. In modern terms, these dimensions would be 18.67 miles by 13.33 miles, the stade being 2/15 of a mile. This New Jerusalem would have been larger than any ancient city and could only have been built by divine intervention, like the even larger city beheld by a later visionary in the New Testament book of Revelation." End quote. So the scrolls and its translators give us the exact measurements of this oblong and unrealistically large city that is 18.67 miles on the east and west, or north to south, and 13.33 miles on the north and south lines, east to west. Using Google Earth, I decided the best way to measure the Salt Lake Valley. And I want to emphasize that I decided on my measuring points before taking any actual measurements. I chose the points and just measured once, and these are the results. And so I measured the Salt Lake Valley along State Street as it runs the entire north-south extent of the valley. Two obvious measuring points for the State Street are from the Capitol on the north down to Bangerter Highway, the last major crossing point at the valley's southern extent. The distance between those 2 points is 18.72 miles. I was very surprised to find that to be just 0.05 miles off from the north-south distance described for the New Jerusalem in the scroll. That's certainly within the margin of error of translating ancient stades into miles. I then found the center point on State Street between the Capitol and Bangerter Highway to measure the east-west distance of the valley. So I picked the major roads running north and south on each side of the valley, which was Highway 111 on the west to 190 on the eastern border. The distance between those at the midpoint is just 13.36 miles. That is just 0.03 miles off the east to west measurement of the New Jerusalem in the scrolls. The temple scroll describes a wall surrounding the New Jerusalem with 12 gates, one for each of the 12 tribes of Israel. This feature was also included in the cities of God seen by Ezekiel and by John the Revelator, but does not appear in the Salt Lake Valley. However, in almost every other respect, the New Jerusalem recorded in the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Salt Lake Valley share a remarkable combination of design characteristics. Most cities outside of Utah have only a few of these characteristics, but to find 7 major distinctive characteristics shared by both of these cities of God, including, of course, the almost exact dimensions, pushes the correlation to somewhere beyond coincidence. Could it be that the Dead Sea Scroll prophet was shown the future Salt Lake City as a city built by Ephraimites in the last days for the very important role it would play in helping to usher in the millennium? As for the wall, although there is not really a wall around Salt Lake City with 12 gates, however, a distinctive feature of LDS doctrine is that re-entry back into Heavenly Father's kingdom requires one to be of or adopted into one of the 12 tribes. The 12 gates in the vision could be symbolic of that requirement. Worthy members of the LDS faith are encouraged to receive a patriarchal blessing, a part of which is a determination of which of the 12 tribes that person is associated with. It could be that the wall surrounding the city of God described in the Dead Sea Scrolls vision is symbolic of the necessity of being associated with or adopted into one of the 12 tribes who covenanted with God along with Moses at Mount Horeb, or also known as Mount Sinai. It's my belief that the scrolls at Qumran are describing Salt Lake City, which was promised long ago to the tribe of Joseph when God's word would be established and come forth from the everlasting hills, which many LDS scholars consider to be the Rockies, and some possibly would combine that together with the Andes, which would be a very, very long and seemingly unending chain of mountains. This very long chain of mountain ranges also holds a very high concentration of members of the Church of Jesus Christ, who are either blood relatives or adopted into the 12 tribes of Israel. Considering the importance to the ultimate fulfillment of Abraham's covenant to God and all the prophets who followed him, it shouldn't surprise us that a former prophet may have seen this important city of God in vision and see it established in the everlasting hills as a preparation for the establishment of the New Jerusalem, or the true Zion, making way for Christ's second coming. Let me know in the comments what you think about this idea. I believe there's sufficient evidence to move this possibility from a hypothesis to a probability. But let me know what you think. And if you think this video gave you some real food for thought, give it a like, and thanks so much for listening.